Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you to CERT Latvia for inviting me to come out and present. So, as mentioned, I'm Raymond Schippers. I'm one of the lead analysts with the Checkpoint Incident Response team. I look after the team based in the Africa, Middle East, and Asia area. And part of my other responsibilities is to lead the outreach, so working with organisations such as law enforcement, CERTs, and private industry around the world. Before joining Checkpoint, I was a security operations lead at a gambling company, and my favourite sport is hunting bad guys and working with organisations to just find out who's in the network and what's happening. Our team, very quickly, is one that provides 24/7, 365 coverage for cybersecurity incidents. So we work with customers in government, in finance, in medical device manufacturing, and a whole other large variety of verticals. So we come in and assist organisations. So we work with organisations when something bad has happened. When somebody has kicked the pieces off the chessboard, as I mentioned this morning, we come in and we start investigating their perimeters, their endpoints, a whole variety. It's actually best summed up in a screenshot from a recent assessment we were doing, where somebody was having a very, very bad day. As you can see here, we did a scan, a network segment of roughly 60 hosts, of which 48 were compromised, with 665 indicators of compromise found on those 48 hosts. So, needless to say, it was not great for them, and somebody had very, very clearly kicked the pieces of that chessboard. So what are we seeing? Globally, right now, and throughout the European region as well, we're seeing a huge increase in the amount of malware attacks. We're seeing a significant increase of actually Office 365 compromises. As you can see here is a breakdown of our Q3 ending at the 1st of this month, figures of what calls have we received. So in the last quarter, we handled about 300 incidents, and 13% of which was Office 365. But as you can see in comparison, the business email compromise for on-site was only 1%. So Office 365 is a significant target and something that we're seeing as an ever-increasing threat. Malware is starting to become a significant issue as well, and I'll be talking about the main challenges we're seeing with that shortly. So I'll start with business email compromise and why this is of such great concern for us. We're starting to see organisations move more and more towards the cloud. It's something that's being rapidly adopted throughout the world. But what we're seeing is what's called business email compromise. So what happens is that an attacker, they'll email out a phishing link, a lure as we call it, to a well-researched target. What is happening with these cloud providers is that unfortunately they enable APIs that can easily enumerate users and enumerate the targets without the owners of that system knowing. So for example, it was recently announced that Office has actually made some changes because there was a user enumeration vulnerability in ActiveSync. So ActiveSync is enabled by default, and so an attacker can enumerate every user on your Office 365 tenancy simply by asking ActiveSync, does this user exist, yes or no? So the attackers understand who the users are. Through social media platforms, they'll probably have a good idea of what the user's role in your organisation is, and so they can send out a lure that's reasonably effective. We're seeing click-through rates of about 5 to 10% in these cases. And so what they'll do is they'll target a large swathe of your organisation with different lures, and so even if they get one user, they're set and they start. Then they'll start doing reconnaissance. What do they have access to inside of your network, inside of your Office 365 tenancy? In most cases, just that user's mailbox. But it provides a good indication of what is the communication patterns of this organisation, what is expected behaviour, and what are the discussions they are having over email. If it's not of interest to the attacker, they'll start then moving laterally through the Office 365 tenancy by phishing other users. Now this becomes highly effective because the default controls built into Office 365 and some other third-party security controls as well trust all internal to internal emails. So there is no anti-phishing, no security applied at all. So once a user has been compromised, it's game on for the attacker. And we've had this in hundreds of cases over the years. So once they find somebody that they're actually interested in, they'll start monitoring the mailbox. They'll deploy the tool set, usually living off the land and using the native built-in capabilities of Office 365. They'll create an auto-forward rule so that the attacker can read all the user's email without the user even noticing. It means they don't have to log in. It also means that if the user changes their password or anything else, the attacker's not locked out. They still continue gaining their intelligence. And then they wait for a discussion about a banking transfer, in most cases. And when that happens, they'll insert themselves into the conversation, and all of a sudden, they'll say, hey, actually, sorry, the bank account I just sent you is wrong. It's closed for auditing purposes or for some other reason. Please actually transfer the money to this account. And it's amazing how often that is actually believed. One of our larger Office 365 investigations was caused by this phishing page. It's a rather old phishing page. Office 365 login doesn't even look like this anymore and hasn't for quite some time. But users at a university, the educational staff, the professors, received this link, clicked on it, and typed in their credentials. So that very quickly was then using the pivot capabilities, became 500 compromised accounts within 24 hours. What the attacker was very clever to work out is that Microsoft has a limit of 10,000 emails per user account per day. So the attacker, helpfully, when they realized there was absolutely nothing valuable in this environment, started sending out spams from these compromised accounts. But they sent out 9,500, so that they would stay within the thresholds and the user could still send some emails backwards and forwards and not realize their account was compromised and they were being used to send spam. In this case, the university got off reasonably lucky. There was no financial loss, significant incident response time. The case ran for about 30 days because what would happen is that one account would be identified as compromised. We'd investigate, we'd look for the TTP, where did they log in from, identify a few others, and then the next day, a different account would have come up as compromised. And so in the end, we built up a picture of about 500 compromised users, but because we had no way of knowing how many other accounts may potentially have been compromised, they had to do a full password reset for all 5,000 educational staff. And so that came at quite a heavy cost for help desk time. However, compared to one of our other customers, they came off very light. We had one small business where an accounts person had their email compromised. Again, lateral movement inside the 365 tendency through phishing. They were in this for about a week. They were just reading the emails, understanding the behavior of this business, how would they work. They identified who the CFO was, targeted him, and then compromised his mailbox. They found one key email in his mailbox. It was the full customer list of this entire organization. So they simply thought, you know what? We'll fire off an email to all customers. From CFO, subject, change of bank account. Hi everyone, we've changed our bank account. Please pay all your outstanding invoices to this new bank account. Thank you very much. So we received a call a week later. Hey, we've lost $2.5 million. Can you help us find it, please? Unfortunately, within 24 hours of those transactions happening, they were transferred through money mules within the country and then transferred off to their external destination. So there was absolutely no money recovered in this case. So the cost of these cases is significant. And so what we strongly advise organizations to do is start becoming aware of what are actually the best practices. So Microsoft actually has released a very helpful free tool called Security Scorecard, which you can enable in your Office 365, and it will actually step you through the best practices. And it's obvious things like making sure you use multi-factor authentication. It's amazing how many organizations don't do that. Make sure you monitor. But it's also very key that you are aware of how to actually respond to an Office 365 compromise. Most organizations don't realize that even if you change your user's password or reset it, the active sessions aren't revoked at all. So anyone logged in will still stay logged in and the attacker will maintain their progress. We're also starting to see significant use of malicious OAuth applications, and that's another thing to investigate. So definitely follow the Microsoft security best practices. Most organizations, unfortunately, are not, and that's where they can fall victim very easily. It's also critical to use a proper security solution that doesn't just trust implicitly all internal email communications. The other key thing to be aware of is make sure you actually look at the forwardings. So this is actually a dashboard Microsoft provides in your Security Compliance Center. If you start seeing auto forwards in here, you're probably having a very bad day and you should investigate. We'd also strongly recommend making sure you turn off auto forwards by default, because there should be no reason. But these techniques, these capabilities that are being used by cybercriminals are also actively being exploited by APTs. We've worked several cases already where law enforcement, intelligence agencies have come to our customers and say, hey, by the way, is this your entire mail spoof by any chance? Because we found it in a recent investigation involving APTs. And then usually senior management goes quite pale at that thought. And so if you have or deal with government agencies, you're dealing with government contracts, you will be targeted and your Office 365 could easily get compromised. The bigger threat that we're seeing right now in terms of damage and cost to organizations is something called advanced persistent ransomware. It's something we've been actively investigating for quite some time now, but it has gotten significantly worse over the last couple of weeks. What is happening is that we're seeing a certain APT group using TrickBot to gain access to networks. They've changed TrickBot to now be modular, support lateral movement, and that diagram I showed you earlier of the massively compromised network, that was because of this new version of TrickBot. What is happening is that there's one PC that was compromised, they dump the hashes, they perform your traditional lateral movement, but they aim for the domain controllers. They take over Active Directory, and they sit there and wait. And they just take a time to dwell. They're quiet, they're peaceful, they don't do any damage at this stage. They're just performing reconnaissance. They understand who's the Active Directory admins, what are the privileged accounts, where are your backups, what are your most important servers, what are your assets, and how much is your company worth. The idea is to understand how much ransom they should charge you when they launch the attack, what assets to destroy, and how to effectively lock you out of Active Directory all at the same time. We had one case where the dwell time was 1 week. We've had other cases where the dwell time has been a month. So this threat actor was inside this environment, just waiting, just watching for a month for the perfect time to strike. They'll wait for your end-of-month processes. They'll wait for all the important information to be ready to be destroyed. Then they'll strike. So they've kicked in the door, they've taken over your network, and you don't even realize that you're there. They've done all their lateral movements, their reconnaissance, so they understand what is your backup strategy, how are you backing up. And unfortunately, most organizations today have decided that tapes are old school, they don't want to use tapes anymore, and they'll just use online backups in network storage systems. Well, unfortunately, these network storage systems, while they might be read-only or something like that, they are still accessible online, so the attacker will compromise them and then destroy all the evidence, all your backups. And then obviously, we have all the lateral movement. So we've seen cases where something like 75% of a network is completely compromised with this TrickBot and the attacker. So what happens is the attacker will get in, won't use TrickBot to deploy the malware, they'll do that manually. So they'll create a custom piece of malware for your organization that's unique, and then deploy it everywhere. We've had cases where 300 servers were encrypted in one night. They then changed the default admin credentials and all the domain admin passwords to lock the customer out of their Active Directory, and then ask them for $250,000 in ransom. We've had cases where the ransom has been closer to $1 million because they knew they deleted all the backups the organization had, and unfortunately organizations have been paying. And we understand that this is from an APT because the ransomware is something called Raikou. We've done an in-depth analysis of this ransomware, and it seems to be very closely tied to Hermes attacks and the Lazarus group. So it's definitely something that we're starting to see globally. These threat actors are not targeting any region specifically, they're targeting anybody they can. As a result, we've had dozens of cases per week of TrickBot infections. We've been working closely with our friends in the security community, and we are starting to now get ahead of these infections, where TrickBot is being detected much quicker and much earlier with updated signatures, and so we're now responding mostly to TrickBot infections rather than the ransoming. But the other big challenge we have, and as people pointed out this morning, is stupidity. Unfortunately, we are still seeing so many organizations exposing simple things like remote desktop to the internet. We've had hundreds of cases in the last year of organizations being compromised through simply exposing RDP by accident or on purpose. We had one case where a customer exposed RDP for 35 minutes, and that resulted in a complete compromise of their network and a ransomware deployment. The bad guys are scanning constantly for these RDP. They're very good at it. They're very quick at it. It is being cleaned up thanks to work for organizations like Shadow Server and CERT around the world, but it's still something that's happening way too often for our liking. So definitely make sure you understand what is your threat profile. What have you got hanging out there? What is exposed to organizations? If you just type in your IP range into Shodan and see what's shaking loose. RDP is being heavily exploited, and we had one customer who very helpfully for the attackers exposed Windows remote management. So definitely keep an eye out for that. So what can you do to mitigate it against these attacks? And it's not just these kinds of attacks, but any kind of APT attack that we deal with. Make sure you segment your network. Make sure you don't have the default or the same local admin account in on every PC in your organization. One of our cases, we learned this the hard way. We had a medical device manufacturer, a massive global company, plants all over the world, and one gentleman in one of their plants decided he wanted to study the Bible while he was controlling the CNC machine. But he didn't want to pay for this Bible study program, so he decided, you know what, I'll download a keygen for this and have a keygen for a Bible study program. What could possibly go wrong with this? And so this customer had most of the right things. They had advanced border security controls, they had user behavioral analytics, they had all these kinds of things going on. And so this gentleman downloaded his keygen, installed it, started studying the Bible and everything. Everything was looking all right for a while. But then they started seeing these communications to this ballerina forum in Australia, and all this manufacturing facilities were in the US, Mexico, Italy, places like that. So no reason to be connecting to a ballerina forum out where I live. So they asked us to investigate, and one of the first things we do traditionally is let's gather a memory dump. Let's find out what's running, what's happening on this PC. So we do that. The PC reboots. We go, well, that's odd. We'll try on the next PC. Maybe it's just an issue with this PC. It's a bit old. It's sitting out in a factory. The next one reboots. We're now starting to get intrigued and worried. So we start reverse engineering what's going on. We then have a look at the images that are coming down from this ballerina forum. It turns out it's stenography. They're hiding all the command and control communications inside all of the images. So we start working on reversing that stenography. In the meantime, we tweak to the fact that this is probably some sophisticated malware that's identifying we're doing memory dumps. So we just take a full disk image, and unfortunately not much luck there. So we decide, you know what, we'll put in a fresh PC, unpatched, on the network, and we'll put a physical PCAP file in front of it, a PCAP device, sorry, in front of it, and see what happens. Lo and behold, the PC connects. While all this, the malware connects to it, deploys. And while we were doing this investigation, we were also wondering why is the user behavioral analytics not firing off? It's obviously using a privileged account. It's obviously impersonating users. What's going on? Well, what the malware was doing was using the local admin account on Windows, because that doesn't log centrally to Active Directory, bypassing the user behavioral analytics. What we had identified then, when we finally got the malware sample, was that it persists through WMI, it's in memory only, and it will reboot if it encounters any memory capture tools, any PCAP capture tools, any kind of forensics attempt on these workstations, it will auto-destruct and reboot the PC. So luckily, within 24 hours, we managed to identify what this malware was doing, how it was behaving, and we actually found this fantastic free tool from Microsoft called Laps, which sets a different local admin password on every PC, which helped us contain this. So definitely recommend using Laps. Set different local admin accounts on every PC. Another new feature that most organizations aren't using is something called the Protected Users Group in Active Directory. That, again, removes the capability of mimicaps and things like that to grab hashes out of memory. Something else that will scare most organizations is a free open source tool called Bloodhound. Run it against your Active Directory, and it can show you how an attacker will pivot from a normal unprivileged user all the way to domain admin rights. It will show you where you have overlap of privileged accounts, non-privileged accounts, and how an attacker could easily pivot. This is something that attackers are doing day in, day out. And it's something that the APT groups that we're fighting against, specifically organizations such as the Big Brothers, the Chinese that we're chasing in Australia as well, they're very good at that. They'll simply move around the network, identify what privileged accounts are lying around in memory, and then start using those. They'll live off the land and use the tools available to them. Lastly, I quickly recommend make sure you actually hold all inbound traffic, all files, scan them, don't just let them through. And while it is controversial, we'd highly recommend HTTPS inspection. The bad guys are doing encrypted traffic, so unfortunately, it's something that we need to look inside. Some of the other interesting cases that we have seen, not necessarily from APTs, but probably script kiddies, is that as people move their authentication systems to the cloud, make sure you understand what you're exposing and what accounts. We had a customer that accidentally exposed their SharePoint portal, and they allowed the admin account for their entire Active Directory domain to log into the SharePoint portal. So somebody was brute forcing that and managed to lock out every account in the organization, including all their domain admins. That was a phone call to Microsoft to try and unlock and sort out that Azure AD mess. So definitely understand when you move into the cloud what you're exposing. Script kiddies will cause this kind of error, and APT will be much quieter about it. Some of the other interesting things that we're starting to see from APTs and the more advanced threat groups is attacking the actual e-commerce systems. We had an organization where a phishing email was sent to their e-commerce administrators that were using a cloud-based service, and their cloud-based service was on a .com domain. The attacker had managed to register the .tk version of this domain. Nobody noticed. The email came in, it was from the right domain according to the admin, looked exactly perfect, no problems. So I clicked on the link, logged in, and as usual, no MFA. So this group then logged into the e-commerce system, and then just started understanding what were the discount codes. How can we start stealing from this organization and defrauding them by simply using the discount codes and creating new discount codes. Whilst they were doing that, they understood that there was a ticketing system inside their organization which contained tickets about all the new discount codes, and they could use that to request a new discount code. So they then deployed PowerShell Empire into the organization through another malicious document, pivoted to this ticketing system, added themselves to the ticketing system, and simply requested a new discount code so they could get shoes for free. And so then the attacker started ordering free shoes from this high-end clothing manufacturer. So we're starting to see some very crafty attacks out there. The lines between APTs and these threat groups is starting to blur, and the capabilities are interchanging. We know roughly we have a very good understanding of where this threat actor came from, and it is quite likely that by day, this kind of threat actor is working for an intelligence agency or for an APT group, because the tools, capabilities, and techniques used were exactly those of a quite sophisticated attacker. And at night, he just wanted some shoes. Some of the other issues that we are facing in the incident response community right now is working with law enforcement. In most countries, law enforcement is fantastic. We love working with them. The certs have also been amazing. But occasionally you run into an issue like we had, where this is an Australian bank. It's a phishing site. It looks exactly like the actual bank login page. It was fantastically done. Most of these phishing pages are so obvious, we'll notify Google Safe Browser or something like that. But this was so well done, so sophisticated. It asked all the right questions. It stole MFA tokens, all of those kinds of things that kind of piqued our interests. So we contacted some law enforcement friends of ours in Australia. They were definitely interested as well, and we wanted to do a joint operation to understand who is creating these kinds of phishing pages, because this is kind of taking it to the next level, and we're going to start seeing some significant impact. So the country that was hosting this was contacted through an arrangement, and the country that was hosting this went, not a problem. It's not targeting our users, move on. They wanted a court order to take it down. Rightly in Australia, we have better things to do with our time. We were interested, but not that interested, and so unfortunately, it never went anywhere. So these are some of the issues that we are having. Definitely communications. What one organization calls a specific threat actor group versus what somebody else calls a threat actor group is starting to become very challenging as well. There's this huge spreadsheet we're now tracking of what everyone calls every specific threat actor group, and just trying to understand, well, APT28 is Fancy Bear, is this, is that, it starts to become a huge nightmare. So some kind of standardized format on what a threat actor is would be very, very nice. And the other big challenge we're facing this time, there's so much activity, so many threats in the landscape today, just the noise level, it's starting to become very hard to pick out the threat actors in time. So that's it from me. Any questions?
Hello. What's your opinion? How much does the MFA mechanisms supported by Office actually help? Because I guess they're theoretically phishable too.
Yeah, absolutely they are phishable. There is even MFA bypasses that can happen. The attackers that we're seeing attacking Office 365 today, they don't even hide where they're coming from. We know exactly which country they're coming from. We know exactly who they are. There's just absolutely nothing we can do about it. So they're not sophisticated, and they just move on to a next target. So it's more about making yourself more difficult than the next person.
Thank you for the presentation. I'm not moderating, unfortunately, but in the last of the sessions, we talked about the TTPs, and I know that you told that Checkpoint collects a lot of metrics. Does that allow you to gather the TTPs and identify threat actors, or where they are combined, and out of two you have now seen one, or if that's a different region and so forth? And of course, if you can tell more about the metrics, what you see as well, would be awesome. Thanks.
Yeah. In some cases, absolutely. So we're always continually evolving our data collection to enhance it and get better resolution, I guess you'd call it, to understand more the TTP. In some cases, absolutely we can. Unfortunately, because of tool reuse, re-weaponization, all those kinds of issues, it starts to become difficult, and usually you need to have the full context of the attack. So that's where our team comes in. We have the benefit that we are usually running the incident end-to-end. So we start to build up a picture of, well, what did they actually target? As a vendor, we can definitely see suspect emails, suspect activity on hosts, but we don't necessarily have the full context on how important is that host, what does that host actually do, and that's what during our investigations we find out, and that can definitely help us identify what is this attacker after. So we definitely have had APT cases. We found through telemetry data, but most of the APTs that we're tracking is through our cases, but we are actively currently tracking some APTs that we have found through our updated telemetry data and trying to track those down. But then the challenge becomes, again, notifying customers, obviously we don't know who the customer is, so then we have to reverse engineer, okay, who is this attacker targeting, which kind of verticals, then we work with the certs to alert those regions. So recently in Australia, for example, there was a large attack by an APT against various banks, tier 2 banks in Australia. So we don't know who the banks that are being targeted are, but we saw we saw some indicators firing that we knew that was happening. So we then work with the local certs, try to contact the banks that may have been impacted and start doing those kinds of investigations. So the tail on those kinds of cases is quite long and can take quite some time.
While there is no question, I'll give a short comment. Thank you for pointing out how useless academic institutions are. I mean, like, you can siphon off $2.5 million from a small business, while all you can do to a 5,000 employee university is like send some few spam messages. So.
Well, in that case, they just targeted the wrong tenancy, so the university got lucky there.
Thank you, Raymond. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Wait.
Thank you. Thank you.